Well, good late morning to everybody. I think we've probably got most people coming in that will be spending time with us. Yeah, I'll close that door, thank you. So thank you for making the time today. We live in, like I said a couple of weeks ago, and if you didn't listen to me, I'll repeat slightly some of that now. We live in super troubling times in some respects, don't we? I also think, like, Ecclesiastes, where it says there's nothing new under the sun. We've seen division and conflict. We've also seen peace building, and it's a repetitive part of human cycle, isn't it? The human experience. And so in church leadership, we've been discussing this a little bit because we have a very broad congregation politically. We have a broad and disparate set of experiences in life. And it kind of like occurred to me that I have within the family I'm married into somebody that's experienced all of this and more. So I asked my father-in-law, David, if he'd come and speak to us while on vacation. And the answer was yes. Thank you, David. So I'll introduce Reverend Dr. David Celements. We're going to do a little sort of 20 minutes, half an hour. He's going to talk. And then at the end of it, I'm going to run around with a microphone and take questions. So if you have questions, write them down, save them up, and then we can talk briefly at the end, if that's okay with everybody, okay? Thank you. All right, David.
Thank you very much, Owen. And I'm pleasantly surprised that so many of you have stayed behind for an extra session. I hope it will be worth your while. I will try to remember that Irish people usually speak far too fast, and you can't understand it. Now, I have been in America before. I did a pastoral exchange with a pastor in Charlotte, in North Carolina, about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now. And I discovered then that they heard about half of what I said. And then the second week I learned to slow down a little bit, and also the way I pronounce certain things is a little bit different. I did announce on one Sunday that the following Sunday I was going to preach from Psalm 10. And Mr. Bill, who was the old guy from up in the mountains who didn't understand half of what I said, said to me, is that first Psalm or second Psalm? And then I learned, I'm going to speak from Psalm 10. And then he got it. So I've learned a little bit. I've also learned that there's a wide variety of theological and political opinion within the Methodist Church in America, and I'll try to avoid any potholes there. But I just thought I would tell you this little story that might set the scene. When I did that exchange in the early 2000s, I had a wonderful children's story that I saved up for near the end of my time there, because I had an amazing picture, and I asked the boys and the girls to come up to the front and showed them this picture of me shaking hands with someone famous. 2 years, 3, maybe 5 years before that, 1988, in May, June 1988, I had been with a group of women from the Wave Trauma Center, which I've been involved with for more than 30 years. I'll tell you a little bit about it very briefly, but you can Google it and find out all you want to find out about the Wave Trauma Center. It was set up in 1991. I got involved in 93, 94. And we took a bunch of about a dozen women to Harrisonburg, the Eastern Mennonite University, for trauma training. I did the 10 days course on peace building with John Paul Lederach, a name some of you might know. He's a Mennonite. If you're interested in peace studies, he's still around and alive and has written some amazing stuff, and it was a privilege to study with him. We went then to the White House, and 12 of us went in the minibus. I was the only man in the group. The others were all women, mostly widows, or some who'd lost their son. One was Margaret McKinney, who was a very dear friend of mine. Her son, Brian, was what was known as one of the disappeared when he was in his late teens. He was abducted by the IRA together with his friend, John, and they were murdered and buried secretly. And for years and years and years, Margaret wasn't told where they were. And so we had a campaign to recover the remains of the disappeared. It's been a largely successful campaign. There are 4 still left that we know of, possibly 5, whose remains have not been uncovered, even after this long time and several digs. So Margaret was sitting there. I'm sitting beside Margaret, and Bill Clinton was sitting the other side. And they take your pictures, you come in. So some of the ladies had their pictures taken shaking hands with Bill Clinton, and then it was signed by Bill Clinton. I had my picture taken shaking hands with Hillary. And mine was the only photograph. They sent it to you about 3-4 months later. They send you these photographs from the White House. And mine was the only one signed by both of them. Back in the day, I used to joke that I've got a photograph signed by a former and possibly future President of the United States of America. That boat has sailed, obviously, I presume. But the funny story was, I had this picture, and I got the little boys and girls up, and I said, boys and girls, I've got a picture of me shaking hands with someone very famous, someone that you will know. And I showed them this picture of me shaking hands with Hillary, and truth to tell, Hillary making eyes at me in the picture. I haven't brought the picture with me, but if you want to, I'll... The amusing bit was, though, that as I showed this picture, there was an audible hiss coming from the congregation. And as I was shaking hands at the door with people, several people quietly said to me, you know, some of us in this congregation are Democrats, but they didn't like to say it too loud. So maybe going out, one or two of you might say, you know, there are a few of us here, and I'm a Republican. But you take your pick. So I'm comfortable with whichever side of the fence politically you sit on. I'm not particularly interested in American politics, not particularly interested in Irish politics either. Of course, in Ireland, the word Republican means something different. For the folks in Charlotte who were a fairly red group, I guess, Republican meant Bush and so on back in those days. And my concern is for the little people, both in terms of those who are underprivileged and those who are poor and those who are struggling to make ends meet. But particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, my interest is in the victims of the Troubles of Northern Ireland. 3,500 people have been killed. That's not a very big number, you might think. But if you translate that up to the size of the population of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the population of the United States, that figure becomes something, well, depending how you calculate it, something up to 250,000 to 500,000. So if 250,000 people had been killed in terrorist activity in the United States, you got a sense of proportion. And there are very few people in Northern Ireland who do not know somebody who was killed in the Troubles. For a number of years, I chaired a research project. I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic, but as a layperson, I chaired the cost of the Troubles study. And as part of the study, Marie-Therese, who was one of our researchers, sat down with me to get my story and recorded it and transcribed it and so on. And I just sat down with her. I knew her reasonably well, and we were very relaxed. And I began to tell her stories from my experience. And it was recorded. It seemed to me like we'd maybe been talking for an hour or so. And when she checked the recordings, David, you've been talking to me for 2.5 hours. So I could keep you, but I won't. I could tell you lots of stories. I will try and tell you one that I might struggle to tell you. She's not sitting here looking at me, so that helps. But maybe the one I'll begin with is I started studying at Queen's University in Belfast in 1979. I was a medical student. And in my first term, I was involved in a Christian group called the Young Life Campaign. And on a Friday night, they met in East Belfast. And I was in the middle of an argument with a friend of mine who was a little bit older. He just graduated in law and was doing his training year to be a solicitor. And he was a staunch Presbyterian, strong Calvinist. And I was brought up Methodist. I wouldn't call myself an Arminian, but I'm not a staunch Calvinist, that's for sure. And we were debating predestination and stuff. And the leader of the group, come 11 o'clock, said, guys, you better go home, it's too late. So I said to John, right, next Friday, we'll finish this. So next Friday, I came to the meeting, and John wasn't there. And I thought to myself, he knows I'll get the better of him, he's chickened out. 9 o'clock or so when the meeting was over, the guy who led it came in, and told us what had happened earlier that afternoon. John Donaldson had been on his motorcycle going to deliver a writ to a police officer in the Falls Road area of Belfast. That's a Catholic, nationalist, Republican area. And coming out of the police station on his motorbike, the IRA, thinking he was somebody else, pumped 57 bullets into his body. And he died on the road, on the Andersonstown Road. And Dennis told us this story. I could tell you lots of details, but what sticks very vividly in my mind is standing at John's funeral at the very front, almost at the very front, standing beside his girlfriend, as in Knock Presbyterian Church, as we sang, "Thine be the glory, risen conquering Son. Endless is the victory thou o'er death hast won." I could have told you other stories before that, but that was the most significant, powerful, and impactful event in the Troubles in my life up until that point in 1979. In 1985, I had graduated. I'd worked for a while as a medical doctor, junior doctor. I was ill for quite some months. I was recovering from that and wondering which direction to take. As it turned out, to cut the long story short, I've been a Methodist minister for the last 40 years in Ireland. I know I don't look like I'm nearly 66, but I'm actually nearly 76. So I will be retiring in the next year or two. But on the 7th of December 1985, I was with the youth group in the church that I belonged to at a Christmas event. When we came home from it, I went to the house that I lived in, share with a couple of guys, and the door should have been locked because I had locked it when I went out. And the Chinese guy that I shared the house with was away in Hong Kong, so I don't know who opened. I got back and the door was open. And I went inside, and my best friend, Roger, who'd lived in the house before he got married a cousin of mine, but he still had a key. And he let himself in together with the minister of the church that we were involved in. And as I came in, I just had this sinking feeling in my gut, something terrible has happened. And I saw Sean Cleland sitting there, the minister, and my friend Roger, and Roger just looked at me, standing in the doorway, and he said, "Dave, your dad's been shot." And I said, "Dead?" He said, "Yes." And I tried to gather myself and went up the stairs. So we had a phone upstairs and downstairs, and I phoned one or two of my dear friends, asked them to pray for me, an older man, and traveled back about 50 miles to where my mother was. It was about 11, 12 o'clock at night. I was the last one of the family to arrive home. And it was a bright, cold, starry night, and we lived out in the country. And I embraced my mother as she came outside to me. And the one word of the conversation that sticks in my head, it's a word that we use somewhat euphemistically in Ireland. When something bad happens, we say, "Isn't that terrible?" Or in the colloquial dialect of Tyrone, where we grew up, my uncles would have said, "Tara." Isn't it Tara? It's a conjunction of terrible. My mother had trained as a nurse, so though she was born and bred in Ballygawley, she spoke proper English. And she just grabbed hold of me and she said, "Isn't it terrible?" My father was a policeman. I could tell you his long backstory, but this isn't the time now. He'd been on duty in the police station in Ballygawley on that Saturday night. I was going to go and have his evening meal at 7 o'clock, and going out to get his car out from the police station, there was a ring at the police station gate, someone claiming that they were coming to show some insurance papers to the police. And when the gate was opened, firing opened. My father was shot once, some distance, and shot a second time from very close range. And a colleague was shot as well, who died a short time later. That was by far the biggest impact of the Troubles in my life. I could tell you several other stories in the years subsequent. I worked in Belfast. I was on the scene of the Shangle bomb within 30 minutes of that. I took 2 people with me in my car to the hospital. One, her husband, the owner of the shop, had been killed in the explosion. Elsie had survived because she'd gone down to the bank. The daughter, Sharon, was also killed. Her husband, Alan, has become a friend of mine over the years who's worked with the Wave Trauma Centre. I sat with both of them as the consultant anaesthetist came to tell them that their husband and their wife were dead. And there are other stories I could tell, but I think that's probably enough to give you a sense of the kind of experience that I've been through that shapes how I think about these things. I got a letter in the early 1990s, shortly after Shangle bomb, which was 1993, and a group called Women Against Violence in Power, WAVE, had been established by a Catholic nun and a couple of Protestant women. They always wanted to be a group that was inclusive in the political, religious sense, Protestant and Catholic. Maybe just worth pointing out the conflict in Ireland is primarily a political one. It's overlaid with religion because most of the nationalists are Catholic and most of the British Unionists are Protestant, and so sometimes it's for shorthand described as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. There's an element of that, but it's essentially a political conflict between those who want to be Irish nationalists, have the whole island of Ireland as a separate state, and those who want Northern Ireland, which is presently part of Britain, to remain part of Britain. So that's what the conflict's essentially about. The letter came because they had discovered that there were more Catholics than Protestants involved in the Wave Trauma Centre, Women Against Violence in Power. And they invited Protestant clergy that they could identify in that part of Belfast. So I went to the meeting. I don't know how many letters they wrote. I'm sure they must have written probably a couple of dozen. And I was the only one turned up. I mean, the only minister, Protestant minister in North and West Belfast who came to the meeting. And I was deeply impressed with these women, with their courage, their determination, their conviction to support their children, to bring up their family, to escape the instinctive reaction to retaliate and to be filled with anger and hatred. I haven't time to talk about forgiveness, but that's a very big subject that overlaps with some of this. Our concern has always been primarily to provide support for those people. And the Wave Trauma Centre, back in those days, we had one staff member. She's still there now. She's the CEO. I did a deal with Sandra. She led that group that I went to the White House in '98. And I did a deal with her that I would stay on their board as long as she stayed involved as CEO or whatever her title was back in those days. It wasn't that. So far, I've kept my end of the bargain, and so has she. And the organization now has maybe a staff of 30, 35. And the budget, your budgets are crazy. I mean, to us, a budget of $1 million is amazing. We have a budget of about $2.5 million for the work that we do. And it has been quite remarkable. Now, I think I've probably gone on for more than my 20 minutes, but I want to just take 5 minutes to the verse that I gave Owen as a sort of a title. It's from Psalm 10, or Psalm 10, if I get it right for you. I've preached this many times, and usually it takes 20 minutes, half an hour, but I'll do it in 3 or 4 minutes. It's the place where my father's Bible was left open on the 7th of December, 1985, the day that he was killed. My father was a local preacher. There are a lot of Methodist preachers in my family. I got several uncles who are Methodist ministers and so on. And my father was a local preacher. And he had a Bible study. He had a devotional time with his Bible at a very little small desk beside his bed. And he had left his Bible. So we assumed that this is what he read that day. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble. That's how it begins. Then goes on to be a description of the wicked man, well, the evil man. I'll not read it all. But look at verse 8, if you've got a Bible there and you're following it. It reads, he lies in wait near the villages. From ambush, he murders the innocent. His eyes watch in secret for his victims. Like a lion in cover, he lies in wait to catch the helpless. He catches the helpless and drags them off in his net. His victims are crushed. They collapse and fall under his strength. That's a very vivid description of what happened in that little village where my father lived and served as a police officer for quite a number of years. He'd been in business before that, but he'd been full-time with the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which was the police service back in those days. The psalm resolves itself by going on to speak of how God deals with a victim. Because the profound question in Psalm 10 is not, why does God allow bad things to happen? That's a very valid question, and some have wrestled with it. I'm sure every thoughtful Christian has wrestled with the problem of suffering and evil in our world. The psalmist's question isn't, why, Lord, have you allowed this evil man to do this stuff? The question is, why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? The question is that this evil has happened, and the psalmist wants to know, what was God doing? Was God inattentive? Did God not care? Did he not notice? It's a very powerful accusation against God. And I can't begin to tell you how many times over the years I have spoken with people in Northern Ireland who have asked that kind of question. Now, they often ask, why did it happen? But this is a deeper question for a believer, for a Christian man or woman. Where was God when this happened to my dad, to my friend John, the people in the Shanklebomb, the Enniskillen bomb? I'd worked in Enniskillen before I went into theological college. Mary Wilson, who died in that bomb, whose father, Gordon Wilson, became known throughout the world for his gracious words in the aftermath of the bomb. I knew her. Where was God in that? Psalm 10, and again, I haven't the time to go through it all, but it gives answers to that. Why does the wicked man revile God? Say he won't call me to account. But you, God, see trouble and the afflicted. You consider their grief and you take it in hand. The victim commits himself to you. There's a question about the breaking of the wicked man's arm. I could tell you about that, but this isn't the time now. And then verse 16 says, the Lord is king forever and ever. That was the verse my father had underlined in his Bible. The nations will perish from this land. And then listen to this. You, Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them, and you listen to their cry. Defending the fatherless and the oppressed, so that the man of the world, so that the wicked man may never strike terror again. There's a slightly different translation. There's your NIV version to the one that my father would have had. Causing the evil man to terrify no more is how that translation goes. That's a very powerful consolation to me and to many others, that in the end, God will do justice. But what are we to do in between? In this time of waiting for that? How are we to respond? How's the victim to deal with their sorrow and their grief? And it's not just in the immediate aftermath of that. For I can tell you umpteen stories of people who were traumatized 20, 30, 40, sadly these days now even nearly 50 years ago, who still carry deep scars The story I was going to tell you, which I think I'll be able to tell you, is when Sarah was a baby, about this size, 2 or 3 months old. She's my eldest girl. I've got 4 kids, Sarah, Ruth, Hannah, and Joshua. When Sarah was born in 1992, I took her obviously to visit her nanny, grandma, her grandmother, my mother. And while the rest of the family sat in the house about a mile away from the church, I took Sarah with me in her little carry cot to the little church out in the countryside, just all by itself, little, like a church in the wildwood, you know that old song. It's a beautiful little place, small little church, Methodist church, where we had grown up, where my father's buried. And I took Sarah to see her grandfather. And now that Sarah has children, and without being overly bumptious or boastful, I am a wonderful grandfather. I have a way with kids. I can get kids to sleep that no one else can get to sleep. And that's not just my long, boring sermons. But when I hold one of those grandchildren, I feel Sarah's loss. Because my dad would have been a wonderful grandfather. Now, let me just say 2 things to close. There might be other things that you might like to read and so on. I wrote a piece for the Belfast Telegraph in December, the 6th, I think it was probably on the 6th of December, the day before my father's anniversary. Not this year past, the one before, December 25. It might be behind a paywall, I'm not sure. I have a subscription for the Belfast Telegraph. But if you care to look up, Google the Belfast Telegraph and then Google Reverend David Clements, you will see the piece that I wrote. The editor invited me to write an op-ed for the Saturday. It was actually the Friday. My father was killed on Saturday, but this would have been Saturday's paper on the 6th, the day before the anniversary. And I was able to include pictures of myself, my dad, the famous one with his eyebrow up, which Owen has noticed that Teddy has a look like that, raises one eyebrow looking. That picture's there. And a picture of my mum. She died 3.5 years ago. But in that article, I was able to pay tribute to her for her remarkable courage and strength and witness and testimony. One other thing, a book I've been rereading by a guy called Billy Abraham, an Irish Methodist minister. He was actually the minister in Cullybackey, where I'm the minister now, about 40 years ago, 35 years ago. Most of his career was an academic in America. He was the professor of something or other in Perkins in Dallas. And he wrote this book in about 2012, Shaking Hands with the Devil, the intersection of terrorism and theology. And I had calls recently to plug the book in another different local newspaper in Belfast. And not because he quotes one of my sermons in it, but if you get to whatever page it is, you'll see it. It's only a footnote, but he does quote the outline of the sermon in full on forgiveness and what a forgiving spirit is. And that chapter on forgiveness, which he calls the F word, he said there are 2 words that we sometimes call the F word, and this is the more difficult one, forgiveness. And it's as good a description theologically and pastorally of what forgiveness means as I've read anywhere, and I've read quite a lot. So I think I'll probably, more than my time, Owen, but we'll take some questions if there are some. That's still in print. You'll get it on Amazon. I'm not on a retainer from them. So, but Shaking Hands with the Devil, William J. Abraham.
Great. Well, thank you, David. It's always a joy to hear you. So, any questions? Anyone? I realise we're getting at time, so people need to start leaving. I understand. But has anyone got any questions that have emerged? Yes.
In the 70s, I was involved with the Ulster Project.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how successful was that? I had a wonderful experience. We had a girl at our house, and we did all these activities. For people to know, some of the families took in the Protestant kids, and the others took in the Catholic kids. And then we had group projects and activities in which all of these, there was a mixture. And my daughter kept in touch with Shelley, the girl that was with us for several years, but we never found out if it was a very successful project. Did it help create a united?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I'm aware of the Ulster project. It's been going for a long time. And about, how long ago since Hannah would have done it? My daughter Hannah, my third daughter, 2014, she went to Ohio. No, where'd you go to? Forgotten where she went to. Kansas, sorry, that was it. Yeah, she went to Kansas. And it's been a very fruitful project for the kids who've been involved. And any reports that I've ever heard of kids coming back, they've had a great time. Now, the slightly cynical response that you'll get from some people is, and there's some truth in it, I try not to be overly cynical, but there's some truth in this, that the kids went away, Protestant and Catholic kids, British, Irish, Republican, Loyalist, whatever labels you want to have, and when they were away, by and large, there were a few exceptions, but by and large, they all got on very well. They had a great time in America, and the American hosts were very generous, and it was a great project for those kids, most of whom were from fairly working class areas in Belfast, Portadown, other places, who maybe hadn't very much connection with kids from the other side, because in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, the schooling is still largely separate. The Catholic Church have their own schools, and the Protestant churches transferred their schools in the 1950s. So they are sometimes called state schools, but we prefer to call them church-related schools because there's still a Protestant church involvement in them. But most kids will go to one or other. There is a growing integrated sector, last 10, 20 years, I guess, but still most kids will never. And housing has become increasingly divided. So you have Protestant areas and Catholic areas. So when these kids go away, they have a great time. And it was summed up in I can't remember who this was, but the little voice in my head, I hear this little kid from Belfast say, "Oh, we had a great time. We had a great time, mister. It was wonderful." And we had those Catholics, and we had a great time with them. But sure, when we got back on the Shankill Road again, we were throwing stones over the fence at each other again. So taking the kids out of that was a very valuable thing to do. And hopefully it had a longer lasting impact than just for those short time. Though it wasn't a panacea. I don't think there is a panacea. There's no simple solution. And even the complex Good Friday Agreement is still being worked through, and we're fighting over it still. And victims are very often the ones who have the heaviest burden to carry and get the least amount of support through it. But thank you for being involved in that project, because it was a good thing for the kids that were involved.
It felt very successful where we were.
Yeah.
I was in Pennsylvania at the time.
Yeah.
It was a very successful feeling. And some of our kids went and visited a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, there was two Protestant and a Catholic that all traveled together.
Yeah.
That, have become real good friends.
Yeah. And when my daughter went to Kansas a couple of years later, there were some of the kids, the American kids, came over here, and we had a great time with them as well. So there was further interaction. That was good. Friendships were built.
Thank you. Anybody else? There's one there and one here, so I'll come over here.
So what are the present effects of the Troubles on, the times now in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, it's very deep-seated and long-lasting. And John Paul Lederach, who is a Mennonite and was well known for his peace-building work in Ireland, I remember him saying that, and he had a lot of international experience. He said it takes at least as long to recover from a conflict as the length of the conflict lasted. So if we say the Troubles lasted for 30 years, we are now, in fact, we're now just slightly more than 30 years on from that. And there are some things that you can say have been resolved. There's been a political settlement, which inherently involves inner tensions and contradictions, some see it as a final settlement, some see it as a stepping stone to a united Ireland. So that's still ongoing. In terms of the support for victims, there has been a significant improvement in the amount of finance available as support for victims groups. When my friend Marie McNeith's sister, who started WAVE, she did so because she had a friend whose husband was murdered on the steps of the chapel, actually. Loyalists had killed this guy coming out of church, Catholic church. And she thought, well, I'll send my friend somewhere to find some support. She couldn't find anywhere. There wasn't anything. And this was in the late 80s. And I've sometimes said I've had 8 years of undergraduate training, medical and theological training. 5 years as a medic and 3 years in theology. Now, I have to always add the writer that I fell asleep in some lectures and one or two I missed. But I cannot remember in all of those 8 years of training, medical training and theological training, I cannot remember one single reference to the spiritual, the emotional, the psychological, the moral impact of the Troubles. I remember lectures about putting titanium plates on people's skulls when they've been in serious bomb accidents. And the very first thing I saw as a medical student in theater was a gunshot wound being cleaned in a guy's leg. The surgeons, the medics, learned a great deal about dealing with trauma, physical trauma. But up until that point, let's say 1990, let's say 94, the first IRA ceasefire, there was almost nothing in terms of the pastoral and emotional and spiritual support for victims of the Troubles. Now, that has changed a lot, and there are significant numbers of organizations, including the WAVE Trauma Center. In the end, we decided we had to change the name because Widows Against Violence in Power, it was always widows or widowers, so it was inclusive, men and women. But then we had women and men too who'd lost children. We had people who'd been injured. And so we thought for a long time about what other acronym could WAVE, and we had some weird suggestions, but none of them made any sense really. So we just, by that time, everybody knew what the WAVE organization was, supporting victims of the Troubles. So we just changed the name to WAVE Trauma Center. And that work continues, and I think will continue. Well, I don't know how much longer it'll take. And then sometimes the next generation, they call it transgenerational trauma. I think it's a real thing in some cases. Sometimes maybe it gets exaggerated a little bit. I don't think Sarah suffers from transgenerational trauma. But for some people in some tight-knit communities, it does filter down to the next, and that work still needs to be done.
Thanks,
one more
David.
question, maybe.
Yeah, that's one question.
Thank you. I guess in terms of the work that you participated in, would you consider it focused on those people that had differing views and trying to mend differing views, or supporting those who were a victim of those differing views? And then the follow-on question is maybe some constructive, tangible steps to help support. And I think, you know, in our circumstance, we have differing views, the why it may differ, but I think we have an opportunity to maybe do some things too.
Yeah, thank you. There are a variety of groups that have supported victims, and they have tended to be for their side, as it were. Okay, so you have a group called Relatives for Justice, that's a largely Belfast-based group, who support people who've suffered at the hands of the British or the Loyalist organizations. They're a Republican nationalist group openly so. They're campaigning to get soldiers prosecuted for things that happened 50 years ago and so on. You have other groups on the Protestant side, the Union side, if you like, who largely support their own people, although they do try to be inclusive. But the Wave Trauma Centre has always had that position where they stand in the middle, and we are not politically aligned. And for 30 plus years, we have sought to avoid being labeled as one or the other. Now, sometimes it's been complicated, and we have provided services to everybody. So sometimes there have been people coming for services in our centres who were Republican activists, who were terrorists, for shorthand, but suffered trauma themselves. And then they have received support. But we've had to do it carefully sometimes, because in the same building at times, we may have had somebody who was responsible, or if not them, some of their colleagues, for the murder of somebody else who was in another room, getting similar kinds of emotional, psychological, psychiatric support. So it's a complicated business. In terms, one other thing strikes me, in terms of stuff that I have done and others, now others have done it more effectively and more powerfully than I have, I'm sure. And there's a book coming out just next week, actually, and the title of it escapes me, but David Gallagher, whose father was the Reverend Eric Gallagher, who was a remarkable man and engaged in peace-building process at the kind of higher level within the church. And engaged in meetings with the IRA back in the early 1970s. I have engaged with Sinn Féin, which is the political wing of the IRA. They're inextricably linked, as the phrase has. And I have shared some of the story, including a reading of Psalm 10, with senior Sinn Féin representatives in a meeting organized by Methodists. And the report coming back from some of those meetings, didn't come directly to me, but it came indirectly through others who organized it, was that they had never heard someone who had suffered at the hands of the IRA speaking so graciously and eloquently about their experience. And it made these guys sit up. So those kinds of things have happened and will continue to happen, I guess, for maybe decades to come, because there isn't yet a final settled political situation in Ireland, between Ireland and Britain. And who knows what the next 10 years will bring, even in Britain. It's going through a crazy time, a bit like America as well, I guess. Who knows? There's work for us to do, and praying people, I think, have an important role to play. I'll finish with this one little story. I've been involved in the group in Fermanagh, which is the far west of the province of Northern Ireland. Enniskillen is the main centre in Fermanagh. And I've listened to the stories of people, largely from the Protestant community, the Methodist community, in fact, mostly Methodists, who were attacked by the IRA, going to church. One woman told me the story about going to church with her dad. And because of the threat from the IRA to these people in rural parts of Fermanagh, she had to lie down in the back seat of the car, holding Daddy's shotgun in case they were attacked on their way to church. And somebody at one of these meetings said, you know, it's a remarkable thing that in Fermanagh, the loyalist paramilitaries never got a foothold. In Fermanagh, there was very little retaliation for the attacks of the IRA. Essentially, on a small scale, you could have called it ethnic cleansing, as they particularly picked on and tried to shoot the eldest son in a family so they would no longer be able to run the farm. And at one of these meetings, somebody said, isn't it remarkable that so few of us joined the loyalist paramilitaries and retaliated? And somebody said, I think I know why that is. He said, I think that was because of Wee Maisie. Wee Maisie was a little old lady, small. I never met the lady. She's dead a long time. But she ran a children's club. And in the midst of this area in South Fermanagh, and she taught the children to love Jesus and to love their neighbor. And she prayed, particularly in the aftermath of atrocities and murders. And well, the Enniskillen bomb came fairly late. I think that was 1987. And this guy said, I think many of us refused to retaliate, to join loyalist organizations, because we were influenced by wee Maisie, who prayed for us and taught us to love our neighbor.
Thank you, David. I think we'll leave it there. If anybody has any other questions, you can email me and I'll pass them on to David. And yeah, just thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you, David.